Now, critiquing the audience or addressing the audience is something that is very tricky to do, as essentially it's quite hard to not make the audience feel guilty and make them not continue watching the show. Now, onto one of the most famous examples of this from in the episode titled Homer's Enemy, which follows a new worker at Homer's work, the man being named Grimes. He's essentially an almost perfect worker, always on task, not slacking off. However, he eventually becomes Homer's enemy and essentially he starts to go crazy, leading to his death, and at the funeral they don't even really care, even thinking Homer's just funny. Now, the episode of course caused controversy, as it was basically addressing the audience that these characters you like are not good people, and in real life they would be criminals. And in one scene in particular, it's quite obvious that the writers are almost breaking the fourth wall, talking directly to you, the viewer.
I can't stand it any longer. This whole plant is insane! Insane, I tell you!
Now, the episode is considered to be the most polarising episode of The Simpsons. Some thinking it's genius and innovative for a sitcom, and some people didn't like it, how it basically just made out that these characters are not good people. Which brings me to Seinfeld, one of the biggest sitcoms of all time, following a semi-fictional story about nothing, following Jerry, Kramer, Elaine, and of course George. The show was massively popular, so much so that today Jerry and the other co-creator, Larry David, make $400 million each after each syndication cycle. And it's just as well known as it was then, even making its way into meme culture for almost decades now. Now, despite all that, the show is quite infamous for its finale, which is one of the most viewed episodes in TV history, and to this day is very controversial. As essentially, much like the Simpsons episode a year prior, it calls its audience and the characters.
You're going to be prosecuted. Better get yourselves a good lawyer.
The plot of the finale is that the four of them, Kramer, Elaine, Jerry and George, are on their way to Paris and must take a fuel stop over in Massachusetts, in which they fail to stop a carjacking, even filming it and making fun of it.
And in fact, guys, it's an easy getaway, you know? They can't really chase you.
It's actually doing them a favor.
Which leads to them breaking the Good Samaritan law, and thus they are tried in court and eventually they are put in prison. Now, the episode had been critiqued for being quite mean-spirited and off-key. However, it seems that the main problem that people had was them being directly called out, and that these characters they had grown to love now being shown for how cruel they really are.
But your callous indifference and utter disregard for everything that is good and decent has rocked the very foundation upon which our society is built.
Now, me personally, I think the episode is a perfect end to the show. However, perhaps due to the genre of the show, a sitcom, much like The Simpsons, it might have not just been the easiest thing to do, to call out characters to an audience that is expecting the usual funny adventures, and especially at the time, the happy ending that most people were expecting for the show, given the ending of Cheers and of course MASH. As this is one of the only times it spelled out to the audience that these characters aren't good or admirable people. The only other times being, of course, George's fiancée, who dies from a deadly envelope which George insisted on buying, and the woman that Jerry drugs in order to play with her toys.
Football game.
You took him over to Celia's?
What? It's a victimless crime.
About the woman who's been drugged and taken advantage of.
And I think this is where the show, being a sitcom, in a very strange and unique way, kind of in some ways went against the point of the finale.
This conversation before?
You think?
I think we have.
Yeah, maybe we have.
Now, onto The Sopranos. Now, The Sopranos is regarded as one of the best shows of all time, and a show that changed TV forever. This is thanks to the incredible acting and writing, and the creator, David Chase, who brought a much more cinematic approach to TV, being influenced by people such as Stanley Kubrick and Martin Scorsese. Now, like the Seinfeld ending, it has a very famous finale. However, unlike Seinfeld, it's nowhere near as controversial, despite it ending literally like this. Yep, that's right, cutting to black. However, the show had in fact been foreshadowing this actually happening.
You probably don't even hear it when it happens, right?
Now, the ending, despite also fitting perfectly, was to many people quite anticlimactic. This is due to the high expectations that people had for Tony's ending, which even annoyed series creator David Chase. Quote, "They wanted to know that Tony was killed. They wanted to see him go face down in Linguini. You know? And I just thought, God, you watched this guy for 7 years, and I know he's a criminal, but don't you tell me you don't love him in some way. Don't you tell me you're not on his side in some way. And now you want to see him killed? You want justice done? You're a criminal after watching this shit for 7 years. That bothered me, yeah." End quote. Now, this is an example of vicarious wish fulfillment, which is essentially achieving your goals for other people. One of the biggest examples of this is the obsession of Literally Me characters, thus the name Literally Me. Now, it makes sense why people somewhat like Tony. He is rich, he is powerful, he gets lots of women, and of course, he is very confident. And Chase's point does seem to make a lot of sense, as Tony isn't somebody to be admired, and it's even hinted that Tony was never even a good person at all, and was always this evil.
I don't got a right there. I'm the boy's uncle.
Easy, easy.
However, unlike Seinfeld, it's very evident from the start Tony is not a good person. He's obviously a murderer, he's an adulterer, even though he swears he's a strict Catholic, he's racist, homophobic, and any other crime you can think of, he basically has committed. But due to the nature of the show, it was able to call out its audience in some way, leaving them unsatisfied, which is of course exactly the point of the ending. And it is probably the perfect ending for the show, as if we really did just see Tony's death, would it have really satisfied the audience? Now, I believe overall these endings are both great and fantastic, and both wrap up their respective shows in perfect, neat bow. However, I think due to the genre and the type of shows each series were, the writers essentially calling it the audience, I think it just works much more effectively for The Sopranos, even if I do love the Seinfeld ending. Perhaps being a sitcom, it's just not as effective as The Sopranos in terms of addressing the audience.